Thank you all very much for joining us here in these particularly prestigious sort of surroundings. And I would encourage you, as I've just done, take a walk around the corridor to the left as you come out of the room, and you get the full expansive sort of circular view. And they also have a lovely modern art collection on display around there. So do take advantage of the opportunity to have a look around the Gherkin. In terms of other thank yous, this report would not have been possible without our interviewees, of whom I'm pleased to say we have Michael Abtar, who is Chief Executive at IG Smart, joining us this morning, and we have Laura Scarlett, now of the Ramblers Association, joining us as well. So we interviewed 10 people who were all very generous with their time, their thoughts, their opinions, etc. And that was absolutely critical to framing the overall sort of discussion and conversation. So thank you very much again. From a Profusion point of view, I think the report represents something of a landmark for us in terms of moving the business forward and engaging with a wider sort of marketplace. Put together a short presentation including a couple of introductory slides around the Profusion business and the direction of travel. Anything else for me to say by way of introduction? I think I will dive in to the presentation, if that's okay with everyone. So, as I say, just a couple of words really about Profusion. So as a business, we offer a full suite, or a wide suite of services across the data and digital marketing sort of space. I think Rob, our communications director, likes to describe us as a one-stop shop for data science, data management and related sort of services. They can largely be bundled under three umbrellas. So as a business, we have a heritage stretching back almost 20 years, building out from originally an email-driven CRM focus and growing the sort of sophistication of our offering from there. So we have a marketing services suite expanding from CRM. We also have a data management offering as we've got more involved with a wider range of clients and prospect conversations. It became increasingly important to us to have an offering in terms of data architecture, data engineering. There was lots of appetite and aspirations to leverage data more effectively across different types of organisations. And as you know, all too often the stumbling block is the quality of the data architecture, being able to surface the right data at the right time, the quality of that data, the timeliness of that data. So that's a really important sort of adjunct to our offering. And Ian Taylor, who's with us this morning from Big Dog, is actually here in a sense representing their clients. He's a global live events company, ticketing agency, for whom we are building an initial sort of data architecture for the UK market and then expanding beyond there. So that's a really interesting project for us and a big step forward into that sort of engineering and architecture sort of space. And then beyond that is our broad sort of data science sort of offering, which we hope to sort of keep ourselves ahead of the curve, state of the art in terms of data science. Henrik Nordmark heads up the data science team at Profusion, has been with us about 5 years. Four. He denies it. So Henrik was also one of our interviewees, MBA graduate in many ways. It represents the sort of new breed, if you like, of sort of chief data officers coming through with a business skill set allied to a rigorous, robust sort of data science pedigree, academic background, etc. So Henrik is the man of the future, if you will. But hopefully, you can see the fit really across those three elements of the business. Just to touch on some of the clients we work with, our largest client is the HSBC Group, who we've worked with for over 10 years. So as you might imagine, our data security practices are pretty tight. So within that HSBC Group, we are active in about 15 markets, I think, at the moment, and always expanding our footprint within the organisation, from retail banking to commercial banking, etc., etc. We also work with the First Direct brand and M&S Bank, and you couldn't get two more different sort of complementary brands under that umbrella. Within the Kingfisher Group, we work with Screwfix and TradePoint, and on a project basis with B&Q. And then we've done a wide range of projects with new and different types of clients like Unilever, Coty, Most recently, I think Emirates is our newest sort of client that's run out of our sort of Dubai office at the moment. So you can see, you know, a real diverse sort of mixture of clients, and beneath that, any number of sort of ad hoc project-based clients rather than sort of retained business. So it's a pretty exciting place to be at the moment. It's a cliche, but every project is different, every day is different, and new challenges and new opportunities for us in terms of the use of data. To the reports, hands up who's read it. Look at that. Michael Abtar ingratiated himself to me this morning by claiming to have read it twice, topping up on the train, which I particularly liked. So that means he's read it once more than me. But no, that's it is a full-on report. It's probably a good hour's read. Hopefully it does justice to all the contributions from the interviewees, but I think it gives a real sweeping sort of overview of the landscape, loads of different dimensions of the conversation. And for me personally, I thought it was really important to spend a bit of time within the report focusing on the terminology in this space. You know, as a business, we try and pride ourselves in speaking plain English. I've been known to describe us as the acceptable face of data science today. You know, really demystifying the whole world of data, which can be, you know, completely bewildering and alienating to many people. So hopefully this report makes a contribution to thinking about the terminology we use on a day-to-day basis and knitting it all together. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. In terms of picking out the essence of the report, by way of executive summary. So we started off, obviously the focus was on what is the reality around the sort of chief data officer, particularly in the UK market. And actually the catalyst, the germ of the idea for the report came from Henrik's experience at a Gartner event, I think it was, for the chief data officers. And Henrik was in discussion with a number of people, you know, wearing this sort of job title. And it's quite extraordinary, the consistency of feedback, the levels of, I guess, confusion as to the expectations around the role, weirdness in the sense of their expectations and the reality that they came with, the sense that they were expected to solve everything alone, and just by appointing them everything would be okay, and a lot of frustration, I guess, was the overarching sort of sense. Henrik was there with another colleague. He confirmed very similar feedback from his own conversations, and that's where the idea came from. So, you know, what's kind of going on here? And then at the other end of the spectrum, you had the hierarchy, if you like, of the Gartners and the Foresters, telling us that 90% of organisations will have a chief data officer by Thursday lunchtime. And, you know, this continual sort of cycle of hype and hyperbole was jarring very much with that very personal sort of feedback that we were hearing at the Gartner event. So we thought this is a subject worthy of investigation, sits very well with our sort of direction of travel. So that's the sort of background. So we were really using it as a proxy, I guess, for the health and state of sort of datafication across the UK. Looking at the state of the nation, trawling through all of the FTSE 100 company reports, for example, it's very evident that there isn't a sort of CDO role established at that sort of C level, the board level, or the executive committee. The overwhelming majority of roles are operating below that sort of top tier. I'd add the caveat that that's not always unwelcome, because I think in terms of some people being hired perhaps prematurely without the preparation and the scene setting, etc., that's required, without the resourcing, without a sort of team in place, then maybe it's no bad thing to, you know, bed down at a lower level and feed in to the top level. Highlighted another couple of words here. As I say, I think the terminology is really important. One of those terms is very little used in terms of datafication. One of them is probably widely abused in terms of digitalisation. So I want to tease out sort of what is the relationship between those. And Michael and Laura will know that I had a very simplistic idea in my mind of a sort of linear model of progression, if you like. Let's digitise our information. Let's make everything sort of machine readable. Then let's think about digitalisation and you know, making all our products and services sort of digitalised and the opportunities around that. But the holy grail is really to datify the business, and I think it's a much richer and broader sort of concept. I'm from I guess a sort of traditional sort of marketing background, so I'm always at pains to think about marketing holistically rather than just thinking about digital channels. And I think datafication, in a similar way, extends far beyond the marketing function across all aspects of the business, as we know, supply chain optimization, etc. sorry, lost my thread there. But it covers all areas of the organisation, all touch points with customers, prospects, etc., not exclusive to digital. And I think that is the real challenge, is to knit all of that sort of together. I was reflecting to Anik the other day that perhaps the biggest difference in the retail market, which Anik is looking into at the moment, is not between online and offline, as so much of the story goes. It's between which businesses are most effectively data informed or data driven, across all touch points. I think that's the holy grail. Morning, Craig. Just joining us now is Craig Patton, who is another generous contributor to the report. Was one of our telephone interviewees, so delighted you can join us, Craig. So we're just kicking off really just with introductory sort of thoughts as to Profusion, and just got to the executive summary, and then we'll be going through a line-by-line, page-by-page detailed analysis of the report. Yeah, that was what you wanted, was it? So yeah, just trying to capture the essence of the report as explaining the background to why we started thinking about the role of the Chief Data Officer. We'd had a lot of confusion at Gartner events. We'd contrasted it with the hyperbole in the marketplace. Thought it was a really interesting area to sort of focus on. One of the conclusions was that most roles in the UK are operating below the sea level at the moment. And I was just talking about teasing out the differences and relationship between datafication, digitalisation, etc. Arguing datafication is a bigger, broader, richer sort of concept for the future of businesses and organisations more broadly. Critically, the appointment of a Chief Data Officer must not be regarded as a panacea. If we bring in a Chief Data Officer, everything will be okay. We defer to them, they take charge. They need to be empowered, they need to be supported. The scene needs to be set, I think, in advance of their arrival. It was interesting, lots of discussion as to tensions across the higher echelons of business as this new breed of digital officer and data officer sort of comes on. Not helped by many reports suggesting that the Chief Digital Officer, if not the Chief Data Officer, is the Chief Executive of the future. You can imagine how that plays in the boardroom in terms of who's feeling a little bit nervous around that. And actually the whole role of data is really challenging for most legacy organisations, traditional organisations. It really cuts at the heart of, I guess in many ways, the reasons why the executive team are the executive team, their intuition, their experience, all of the things that have equipped them to get to the top of the tree in a sort of traditional business setting. If we're rebooting the business as a data-driven organisation, adopting a very much a scientific, hypothesis-driven mindset, that's really challenging for a traditional sort of management team, and arguably, as I say, sort of challenges the very justification for their sort of roles. So we'll talk about the importance of a positive data culture operating across all levels. It's immediately obvious that there is no single off-the-shelf sort of model for datafication available. Every organisation is different, and every organisation will need a bespoke path to realise the potential of leveraging their data to sort of best effect. In brackets, you could all benefit from working with Profusion on this journey. In terms of the requirements, time. It's a scarce commodity, arguably the scarcest out there, but that's part of the scene setting, that you don't achieve miracles sort of overnight. The management team, the people providing the investment resources, etc., need to understand this is a long-term sort of programme. It requires resourcing, and it requires resilience. People need to be pretty tough. There will be plenty of knocks sort of along the way, as I'm sure any number of you would be able to sort of share. Time, as I say, is really important, and within the recommendations of the report is making sure that there's a multi-speed approach so that you can show and demonstrate some relatively early sort of business wins. All organisations want to see success stories that will help the investment to be sustained, the enthusiasm to be sustained, etc. Overall, new ways of thinking, new ways of working, that sort of scientific mindset. That's quite a long executive summary. Just one of the quotes within the report, taken from a chap from Google, and who knows where he took it from. If data is king and context is queen, then culture is the throne. And I think that is the critical ingredient. You read a lot of literature in this sort of space that's very dry, and you do this and you do that and you achieve this, and almost completely sort of bypassing the huge challenges around any form of transformation, change management, the implications for individual roles, the additional weight and burden that will be carried by any number of members of the team as this transition sort of process carries on. So I think probably all of us in the room hopefully recognise the importance of data going forward. The context is about the company context, the customer context, the category context, how and when and why are we using data. And then the overarching sort of culture, and that's from the top to the bottom, quite literally. The point of data entry, those operators need to understand the importance of data accuracy and getting the data into the system, rather than paying Henrik's team far too much money to clean the data, which slows down the whole sort of process. So if we can improve the quality of the data coming in, everything else flows much better. From the top down, a clear understanding of the importance of this, data quality, data management, appropriate data architectures, etc. And I think that scientific mindset, that hypothesis-driven, disprove this, I think is really challenging for a lot of people to introduce in a business setting, but quite a contrast with traditional models. We set the stage, I guess, ourselves within the report by talking about sort of 4 key aspects of the overarching sort of operating environment. You'll recognise it's quite challenging out there, weather-wise. Winter's coming. Brexit on the horizon. Very low economic growth by historical standards. I was almost smiling yesterday that the powerhouse economy of the EU, Germany, is celebrating 0.8% economic growth. You just like, wow, that is staggeringly small, but it's been so bad for so long that they're celebrating that and crowing the fact that it's double the UK growth, but it's shockingly low. And that's really quite frightening sort of going forward. But more immediately on the horizon is GDPR, which goes live on the 25th of May 2018. I was just briefly talking to Michael before we started. Starting to see now, sirens sort of going off. People starting to realise we really need to focus on this. There's been a lot of talk. There's been a lot of yes, we know we should do this, but now is the time for action. Some businesses may be struggling if they haven't allocated the necessary sort of resources and investment to becoming sort of GDPR compliant. It's a really interesting and important sort of initiative. Incredibly scary that so many people thought that Brexit meant we didn't need to be sort of GDPR compliant. Brexit's utterly irrelevant. When we were talking about GDPR during the interview with Michael, I think he gave me the idea that really it should be understood as the global data regulations. Anyone who wants to do any form of business with a citizen of the EU, wherever they may be, needs to be GDPR compliant. So wherever you are in the world, if you want to get to the highest standards of data protection, you should be aiming to be GDPR compliant from day one, and that will give you a solid platform sort of going forward. I think we broadly welcome GDPR as a positive sort of step forward. Hopefully it will embolden sort of consumers, give them sort of renewed sort of confidence in the use of their data and the protection of their data. Equally, hopefully it will empower businesses to use data more intelligently, more sophisticatedly. I love the idea of risk management in terms of focusing on what data is really important to this business. We need to minimise the data we hold for risk purposes. So really thinking, smartly about what data are we retaining and for what purpose, rather than, I guess the last decade of hoovering up as much data as possible and thinking about what we might use it for in the future. And overall, it's that level of confidence in the digital economy, which I think is really important to go forward. We won't go into the details, but you'll be familiar broadly with the individual rights that are covered by GDPR. The right to be informed and to request access to your data, the right to rectification for any errors, please remove me, the right to erasure, the rights to restrict processing, the right to data portability. These are all really challenging sort of concepts, technologically challenging, particularly the 72-hour sort of breach notification. It's a shame that Dr. Jamie Graves from ZoneFox isn't here today. He was a fantastic interviewer. They've got a great offering. They see the opportunities around that, and he's very well informed on these technological sort of challenges. The right to object to automated processing of your data could be particularly challenging. If you think about sort of financial services and the way decisions are made with regard to loans and mortgages, really life-changing sort of decisions if you get turned down. And I think it's quite reasonable that you should have a right of redress and understanding, and how was this decision reached at, or reached, what were the criteria within algorithms, etc. And then it goes on to extend those rights to automated decision making, profiling, etc. And talking to Henrik, we recognise the importance of transparency and helping customers and consumers to understand what's going on. But there's a real concern that if that's applied too heavily, if you like, with a lack of sensitivity, that could be a real threat to the evolution and innovation within the sort of data science space. So it's getting the balance right, as ever, with these sorts of regulations. So everyone confident that we'll all be compliant by May 2018? I think it's going to be a crazy few months, to be honest. I think that first quarter of next year, I think as individuals, we will be bombarded with email and other forms of communication asking us to re-sign, re-consent, granular permissions, etc. Those of you who know me reasonably well will know I'm a Leicester City supporter and season ticket holder, and I was hugely impressed in the summer when they sent through the season ticket renewal with a granular checklist of consent for every possible communications channel and type of communications. And I just thought, there is a reason this club became Premier League champions. Did I mention that? So, anyway. So GDPR on the horizon, and then we put that together with open banking, which sort of goes live in January, I believe, certainly the start of 2018, and describing that within financial services almost as a perfect storm. You've got the sort of GDPR compliance, within which data portability is an important sort of ingredient. Put that together with open banking, and that's a double whammy really of challenges facing financial services providers, obviously our clients within the HSBC group. But it's a fantastic model, going forward. This one is wholly reactive from the financial services sector. I don't imagine any of them were particularly willing to embrace this sort of new paradigm. Hopefully they'll warm to it and recognise the sort of opportunities going forward. And hopefully we'll see much more of it across other sectors rather than just being mandated by the regulators or the Competition Markets Authority. You'd expect to see more of it across the utility suite sort of next. And then beyond into other areas of partnerships and open ecosystems. There's a lot of data sharing going on in the retail space as people work out how to compete with Amazon in this new world. So that was the next thing that we put on the operating environments. The bigger picture, the enduring problem of UK sort of productivity levels and a heightened focus, I guess, on our future global competitiveness in a post-Brexit sort of reality. Although I've gone on the record claiming that Brexit won't happen. So we'll see what happens there. I guess one of the alarming facts here, when I've mentioned it to people, they're just horrified that UK productivity has fallen behind Italy, which having been there recently, I find quite sort of remarkable. And if that's the type of thing that's required to focus people's minds, then clearly data, digital has a huge role to play. Datafication of businesses, fundamentally should be driving improved productivity. I think some of the problems around measuring productivity are well known. I think the Office for National Statistics are really struggling to capture all of the different aspects of the digital economy in particular and understand how they can weave those into productivity figures. But the overall problem is the relatively low-skilled economy. We need to move upstream. We need a higher skilled, higher income, higher productivity sort of economy to be sustainable sort of going forward. And we see datafication right at the heart of that. And the other aspects that we were looking at was the overarching sort of austerity agenda that we've been living with for the best part of a decade now. And stripping that down to its basics, how do we do more with less? And that will be an enduring requirement across the public sector, whether we're living in an officially age of austerity or we've moved beyond that. That challenge will always be there. How do we deliver better quality, targeted public services for less sort of capital cost, and clearly data is absolutely at the heart of that. Some interesting work going on across the public sector, and in some respects I think ahead of the private sector in terms of thinking about GDPR, in terms of appointing data protection officers, in terms of appointing chief data officers. There's a lot of activity going on at central government level, from the government digital service and beyond. So in some respects, I think whilst there's often a reference to public sector as traditionally being laggards in this regard, in some areas I think they're moving ahead, possibly from a lower base, but with a clear objective, a clear understanding of the importance of it. I know, Michael, you've been doing quite a lot with the NHS, I think, in that sort of respect. And then, so that's the wider operating environment. As I say, 4 things that we highlighted: GDPR, open banking, productivity and international competitiveness, and public sector sort of service delivery. And then I think there's some particular challenges around the sort of data context at the moment as well. And one of which is a degree of disillusionment, dare I say, with the whole sort of big data sort of paradigm. I was smiling to Alec yesterday as he was heading off to a conference proudly called Big Data London. I was like, so 2015. And sure enough, the feedback isn't amazing. So we'll see. The conversation has shifted. I think we phrased it within the report as smart, actionable data, and that speaks very much to the sort of GDPR mindset as well. What's the important data? What's the absolutely critical data? What's most useful for our organisation going forward, rather than hoovering sort of everything together. I guess big data really came into public consciousness around 2005. I think the first sort of Freakonomics sort of book was out there, and people got particularly excited about mashing up data sets and killer insights, and why have pregnancy rates fallen in New York or crime rates fallen, etc. And it's really fascinating stuff, but it's not necessarily hugely relevant to individual businesses in their operating environment, and therefore I think it's muddied the waters and created unrealistic sort of expectations around the use of data, etc. Hence I put the Gartner hype cycle on the Gartner hype cycle, just to highlight the point, so, which is for my own amusement, but hopefully some of you find it funny as well. In 2015, Gartner removed big data from their core emerging technologies hype cycle. Much scratching of heads and explosion of sort of sentiment. Why has that sort of happened? They argued that it was so embedded in everything else that was going on in terms of emerging technologies that it was no longer sort of relevant, and there was some discussion that it had been almost emptied of any practical sort of meaning. So as I say, focus on smart, specific, actionable data, whilst continuing hopefully to think laterally and to dream big about the transformative sort of power of data. And just extending from that, I guess, in terms of the data landscape, and these are really reflections from prospect and client sort of conversations sort of out there. So we've touched on open banking and GDPR. I'm still surprised sometimes when you come across people who are still really nervous and resistant to transferring data to the cloud. It's one of those arguments and conversations that you kind of feel like has been closed off a while ago, but there's still a lot of concern, doubt, worry, if maybe resistance too strong, but require reassurance, shall we say, on that side. Siloed data architectures, well, a day doesn't go by without coming across that sort of challenge within different sort of organisations, and I think some people, they're simply not able or willing to make the investment to sort of bridge that world and bring those together. Highlighted in yellow, is this real need to move beyond the hype, practical results, evidence. So a lot of our new engagements now are around sort of data explorations. What can we do for you in a very short sort of time frame to demonstrate how leveraging your data will improve sort of business effectiveness, business results, whatever the key KPIs are. Once you've done that, then you start to build a sort of journey and a roadmap of different projects. There's a lot of focus on that. Some people, I guess, are in a kind of state of despair relative to sort of the platform giants, the Amazons and the Googles, the Facebooks. How do we compete with the huge volumes of data that they are harvesting? Cybersecurity, I think, punctuated the whole period when we were doing the telephone interviews. It felt like there was another data breach being reported kind of every other week. I was reading some stuff the other day about Equifax and how much revenue they've already lost and how incalculable the sort of future losses are as a result of that. And certainly that was what we saw in the FTSE 100 sort of reports and our reading around that. Whereas data itself wasn't, pushing to the top of the tree, cybersecurity was, and chief risk officers, and what are the key risks facing them on the landscape. In terms of a definition of the CDO, a C-level executive responsible for data management and governance, establishing and integrating data and information policies in the company. And I think the key thing is aligning data and information strategy with the overall sort of business strategy, knitting it all together, not living in a silo that's just the remit of IT and marketing, etc., and digital, but really knitting the data strategy into the heart of the sort of business strategy. And very different sort of views and expectations across the secondary research and the primary research. A lot of discussion around different reporting lines and positioning within the organisation, different views on the level of strategic leadership required of the role versus devolved sort of implementation. Is it a passive sort of compliance role versus a proactive data sort of strategic sort of role, hence the yin and the yang, which I think I can thank Henrik for. Is it a permanent role? Is this a permanent revolution versus a time-limited transformation project? And I think there's a very clear difference there between in-house practitioners and external consultants. An external, I guess the sort of McKinsey 3-year transformation project versus the realities of a living, breathing organisation, recognising that data is changing the landscape constantly. You couldn't possibly say you finished your transformation because all we see is change. So you continually need to equip and tool yourself for the changing flows of data, changing sort of business context. We've touched on the IT focus versus the business leadership role, and then data ownership versus data management. So, fundamental challenge for the chief data officer is to take control of the data, to wrestle it out of the marketing department, to wrestle it out of operations, supply chain, customer service, whatever it may be, and make it a central business asset and a core sort of business asset. So thinking about the reporting lines, we touched earlier on some of the tensions at the C-suite. If people are seeing these new roles coming in and their anticipated progression to the chief executive chair potentially disrupted, then they're clearly not going to welcome this new breed into the higher echelons of an organisation. But if they think about it differently, and if the ground is prepared sensibly, then the chief data officer should be fueling, supporting, and empowering all of the rest of the C-suite, from the chief executive to the finance officer, the risk officer, the marketing officer. Trying to remember my CIOs now, information officer, operating officer, etc., etc. If data is truly positioned at the heart of the business, then an effective chief data officer should be supporting, driving, influencing, all of the different teams within the organisation. Which I guess sits with that sort of evangelical role that is inevitably sort of key, centralise the data and evangelise about the role of the data as well as the sort of implementation. And then we get into sort of transformation, the overarching sort of transformation agenda, which is where the terminology gets quite chewy, sort of within the reports, but hopefully sort of wrapped it together, keeping that fairly simplistic sort of linear sort of line. So digitisation, which is so often overlooked, I guess, in many cases, but are we really capturing all of the information within our organisations? Are we making it machine readable? Are we therefore bringing it into this sort of new paradigm? The paperless office, hands up who works in a paperless office. Digitalisation then, thinking about how we change business models, how we recognise the shift from products to services, and develop new offerings, new opportunities within that. And then I think the overarching sort of objective, and many people argue the whole point of digitalisation, is to capture that data and create a data-driven, data-informed sort of organisation. So I kind of wrapped all of those together, and I think they all speak to different aspects of the transformation sort of agenda, which hopefully you would broadly agree with. In terms of stages of datafication, developing a positive data culture and sustaining it, that's one of those things that will never stop. Towards better decision making, arguably the whole point of this agenda, this datafication, is about better decision making. So it's not subjective, it's not on a hunch, it's not just intuitions, etc. But importantly as well, I think, as we traverse almost the new and the old ways of working, I think it is important to have a degree of humility, and I think it was Catherine Bryan at the cooperative who mentioned that. It's not all about, this is the new world and we're banging you over the head and everything needs to move in our direction. The simple fact is everything hasn't been datafied, and there is a huge role for intuition and experience, and it's knowing when to push back and when to work together, etc. So I think that's an important point rather than the gung-ho, everything's sort of taking over. But that's just sensible, politics and communications, etc. In terms of strategy, capturing and using data across a range of activities in a way your rivals can't. I've shamelessly lifted from Michael Porter. I think it's quite a nice sort of way of capturing the importance of thinking about the data that you're owning, storing, and how you can optimise that, while aligning data with the organisational strategy. So Laura, I've combined your quote with Michael Porter's there to define the sort of strategy into the governance, the data quality, the privacy, security, compliance, accessibility and architecture. Critical to any success in this space is the quality of data and the trust people have in the data in front of them, that everyone is looking at the same data at the same time, etc. We all know you only need to see a few instances of poor quality data leading to bad decisions to undermine the whole sort of project. So absolutely critical to focus on that sort of data quality, and then beyond that all of the related processes, security, privacy, compliance, all the things we've talked about, the architecture that enables you to surface that data effectively. Critical, that single customer view, etc. And then on to the implementation and how we really leverage the data. We're confident we've got the right data, we've securely stored it, we've got the right permissions, etc. So now what can we do with it? I thought Henrik made a really good comment within the report in relation to GDPR. What are the new things we can do in a GDPR world? Now that we've done all the compliance stuff, we've ticked the boxes, we've got a completely different sort of mentality. Where's our opportunity now? How do we go forward? And what's different about that opportunity? Let's call it in Europe relative to other geographic regions. What are the unique opportunities we have versus a more laissez-faire American model, for example? So I think that's an interesting thought to potentially develop. And then defining sort of digital transformation with a hackneyed picture of butterflies. So the process by which business leaders harness the capabilities and advances of emerging technologies, breathe, to digitally reinvent their company's operations, products, marketing, culture and goals for future growth. That doesn't sound like something that you achieve in a discrete sort of 3-year sort of process. So an ongoing sort of transformation sort of agenda, and it's variously understood. A lot of the things that we were doing, that we do on a project by project basis, would probably be described as digitisation, and then moving into digitalisation, etc. So there's so many different sort of dimensions within it, but I think the overarching definition is relatively clear. And then datafication, as I said at the outset, we believe that's a much bigger challenge, opportunity, game changer, if you like. Ericsson talk about a new process of datafication emerging across the world. In contrast to digitalisation, which focused on productivity improvements and efficiency gains on existing processes, datafication promises to completely redefine every aspect of our existence on Earth, unbundling societal frameworks that have existed for 250 years and more. So Ericsson on steroids, bringing it slightly more back down to earth. Quote Rolls-Royce within the report. And really interesting, an engineering business really harnessing sort of data to transform their business. And they share similar sort of sentiments. This is absolutely a game changer. It changes everything for them. You can't find the quote, so I might have to spare you that one. Yeah, that's it. So Rolls-Royce entire industries face comprehensive changes to the way they operate, thanks to advances in technology, data science and the IoT. If a company can process, analyse and understand all of the relevant data within its operations, the insights gained will transform every single aspect of the business to become more efficient, more profitable and more fully optimised. And they're not even yet a client of Profusion's, so it's fertile territory. And Craig, I think you talked about, where is datafication happening most intensively within organisations, and it's beyond the marketing department. It's the operations, it's the supply chain, it's the production, and I think we get blinded to that in our, speaking for myself, I guess, in our sort of marketing bubbles a lot of the time. We think all of the real creative action is happening within the marketing space, within the customer-facing sort of space. But actually, far more investment, far more sophisticated implementations of data and automation, etc., are happening, in the production sort of side in many respects. Into the future. So in the closing sort of sections of the report referred back to chief electricity officers, which seems to have become more and more common as a sort of reference point in terms of sort of transformations. Nicholas Carr, I think, was one of the first with his big switch, but I've seen it coming through in a number of sort of books recently. Stealing my thunder, if you will. But it's a nice sort of analogy, and that sort of transformation, that shift from the steam engine to electric power. There's all sorts of elements of it that make it a relevant sort of analogy. Catherine from the co-op knew the story far better than I did, which was slightly embarrassing. But she sort of took it forward that everyone was fascinated with Thomas Edison's sort of light bulbs. Everyone wanted one in their home, their office, their factory. So he had no problem getting investment for that and getting distribution, etc. No one gave a stuff about generating the electricity, and he really struggled to get the investment to build the power station, the power plants, and I think had to largely self-finance that sort of stuff. So you can see the parallels there. People obsessed with the shiny things that come out at the end rather than investing in the data architecture to make themselves sort of fit for purpose. And actually that investment in the shiny things is kind of counterproductive. There's research showing that the focus on that is actually damaging to productivity and sort of growth. You need the infrastructure as well as the shiny outputs to really drive sort of growth. The other thing is just switching from steam to electricity without changing the shape of your shop floor. You will not achieve the benefits of electricity. So there was the opportunity to completely transform the workplace, move away from the furnace in the centre of the shop floor, make machines sort of independent, etc. So the visionaries who harnessed that would see massive sort of economic gains. Obviously it wasn't much time from electrification to the Model T Ford and the production lines, etc., which were made possible by distributed electricity. And I guess the punchline is that it stopped being a source of advantage or differentiation, and so the chief electricity officer disappeared, their work complete. Is that the fate of the chief data officer? Was one of the key sort of questions that we asked sort of going forward. And there's some interesting differences of opinion as to whether you needed to keep that chief data officer at the top table, in perpetuity, as it were. If data becomes truly embedded within the organisation, then there clearly is an argument that perhaps that singular job title becomes relatively obsolete. There were some interesting ideas as to what the role might evolve into. I was quite taken, well I would be given my background, sort of chief insight officer, that actually that is the whole point of data, is richer insights, better information, better decision making, etc. A merger of the digital officer and the data officer, so the CDDO, makes a lot of sense in many ways. A few too many Ds perhaps, but yeah, that type of thinking. And then of course you have the other strand where in America they're already appointing chief artificial intelligence officers, which is creating an interesting debate, I guess, whether that's a good thing or not. Is it potentially siloing off sort of artificial intelligence, keeping it in the core of the business? Pros and cons, I guess. And that led to a bit of a discussion as to the differences between the US sort of management culture and the UK sort of management culture. There seemed to be much more embracing of these new roles, much more fluid sort of job titles, etc. So But it's an interesting analogy, the electricity side. So I've talked for far too long as always. So just to recap on the sort of executive summary, if we're seeing the prevalence of CDO roles at board level as a proxy for datafication, then there's an argument that the UK is a long way behind the global curve, and that's particularly important if we're looking at a post-Brexit dash to global competitiveness, etc. Most roles are currently operating below the sea level, but I think we recognise that's not necessarily or always a bad thing. You know, as long as you've got the line of communication into the sea level, whether that's through the strategy officer, the risk officer, information officer, etc. We do believe datafication is a critical phase of organisational development, distinct from digitalisation, with far greater scope and impact. It's obviously intimately related, and you could say we're arguably sort of forcing them apart, but I think it is really important because, as I say, it just empowers you to take a much broader sort of view across the organisation. And actually they're not always as symbiotic as you might think. And I think, Laura, you made that point that often agile, scrappy ways of working can be really challenging in terms of data governance, etc. And it's making sure the two are working in partnership. So fantastic, move fast, agile working, we do it ourselves, and you get some brilliant minimum viable products. But let's please, you know, at the outset, think through the implications for the data, etc. Make sure we're not compromising our broader sort of data sets, etc. The role must not be regarded as a singular sort of panacea for all operational challenges. It requires support from the chief executive and beyond. It needs to be an organisational commitment, and that links into, it needs to be a bespoke approach for each organisation. There's a massive cultural shift required to really achieve the objectives of the exercise, to really leverage data effectively. And then in terms of next steps, I was just going to close, this is the first time we've done such a broad, sweeping sort of piece of research. I think it's a good marker, if you like, in terms of the evolution of our business and sort of taking it forward. And we're keen to continue this type of approach. So we're just sort of planning a follow-up report. At the moment, we're looking at the sort of digital transformation umbrella, if you like, capturing different elements we talked about. And the area I'm particularly interested in exploring is around the sort of, I guess, the API revolution, taking it beyond open banking, etc., much more sort of collaborative sort of data sharing. So I'd be interested in any thoughts at any time as to whether you think that's sort of fertile territory. To me, it speaks to another phase of disruptive approaches, opening up your organisation, looking for partnerships across the business sort of space. I've worked with any number of people who, the idea of collaborating with competitors is insane. Giving something away for free on your website, insane. So just developing that sort of agenda and how people work more effectively together. And I guess in the back of my mind, our digital landscape is dominated by the big four in the west, the big three in the east, and what we need is a much more diverse and dynamic and a different shape to our digital economy. Where can we create the dynamism and the breathing space at smaller levels, and obviously complement the sort of giants that are out there, but create a distinctive type of data culture in the UK and beyond.